Michelle Xavier and Jennifer Dewey were two young women whose lives were cut short during what should have been an ordinary evening out together. The two formed their friendship during their high school years at Notre Dame High School, a small all-girls Catholic institution in downtown San Jose. Michelle, who was 18 years old at the time of her death, was a recent graduate from the school. Dewey, 20 years old, had graduated earlier, and the two had maintained their close friendship even after their high school years. The events that led to the tragic deaths of these girls began with what appeared to be typical weekend plans. Initially, the pair had arranged for a double date with their respective boyfriends for the evening of Saturday, February 1st, 1986. However, these initial plans fell through when their boyfriends canceled the double date. Rather than let the disappointment ruin their evening, Michelle and Dewey decided to make the best of the situation and spend the time together. They decided to rent a movie and share a pizza together, but before carrying out their new plans for the day, they attended a family member's birthday dinner. This gathering was hosted by the Xavier family and took place in Hayward. During the gathering, a photograph was taken of Michelle and Dewey together, showing them smiling and appearing relaxed and happy. The dinner concluded at around 8 p.m., to which the duo left and planned to rent a movie. Their next documented location was a convenience store, specifically a 7-Eleven located in the area of Farwell Drive and Maury Avenue in Fremont. Sources vary as to what time they were seen at the store, but it ranges from 9 p.m. to 10 p.m. At the convenience store, the two friends encountered their boyfriends. The group chatted for a little before going their separate ways. The girls' next stop was a video rental store at a Fremont shopping center, and it's at this point where the girls encountered their killer, who would be identified in 2025 as a man named David Misch. It's unclear how exactly David encountered the girls, but regardless of the exact circumstances, what is clear is that somehow he gained control over the vehicle that Michelle and Dewey were using and forced them to travel from the shopping center to a remote location on Mill Creek Road. Investigators have never been able to definitively establish exactly when, where, or how the initial contact occurred between the victims and their killer. What is clear from the investigation is that the girls traveled to the video rental store at the shopping center using Michelle's 1984 white Pontiac Sunbird convertible. The fact that the two friends encountered David at the shopping center suggests that this was not a case of being followed from a previous location. Instead, it appears that David was already present at the shopping center when Michelle and Dewey arrived, or that he arrived shortly after they did. In later accounts, David stated that he was in the area because the two girls had arranged to purchase several $100s worth of illegal substances. However, this explanation was met with considerable skepticism by prosecutors and investigators. The claim that Michelle and Dewey were seeking to purchase such a significant quantity of substances was inconsistent with what family members and friends knew about the young women. It was at the shopping center that David overpowered the women and gained control of the vehicle. Or rather, some investigators believe that he had total charge over the situation and commanded one of the women to drive to a particular destination, while the other was being held hostage. Afterward, David commanded that they be brought to Mill Creek Road, which is approximately a mile and a half away from the shopping center. During this journey, Michelle managed to write some numbers and letters in pen on her hand. Officials would later determine that this information was a partial license plate number associated with a motorcycle that David owned at the time. Upon arrival at the location, both Michelle and Dewey were forced to remove their clothing. Mill Creek Road in 1986 was a desolate stretch of roadway that provided the perfect setting for violent criminals. The isolation of the location ensured that Michelle and Dewey would have no opportunity to call for help and no chance that passing motorists or residents might intervene. The remoteness also meant that David could take his time with the attacks, prolonging the victim's suffering without fear of discovery. Once the clothing was removed, David tossed them over a barbed wire fence nearby. Jennifer Dewey was killed by multiple gunshot wounds. Underneath her fingernails, officials discovered David's DNA, indicating that she had likely scratched him in an attempt at fighting back. As for Michelle Xavier, she was killed by having her throat slit. The bodies of the women were discovered shortly after midnight on February 2nd by a motorcyclist who was traveling along Mill Creek Road. The individual found them both nude and covered in blood left along the road rather than hidden in the terrain. Police were called immediately, and upon arrival, they discovered Michelle's Pontiac abandoned about 6 miles away from the crime scene. The car was left in the parking lot of the Mission Valley Shopping Center in Fremont. When the vehicle was examined by investigators, they found that the victims' personal belongings had been removed. Michelle and Dewey's purses, wallets, identification, and other personal items were never recovered. The case initially generated significant attention and numerous tips from the public. Despite thousands of leads and several persons of interest identified during the original investigation, the case eventually went cold. For years, the evidence collected at the scene remained in storage, waiting for technology to advance enough to provide answers. And such advancements would come in the year 2016, when DNA from under Dewey's fingernails were finally able to produce a DNA profile. This profile matched up perfectly to David Misch, who was registered in criminal databases. At the young age of 16, David had already been involved in criminal activities. And by the time of the previously mentioned murders in 1986, David had already established himself as a career criminal with a history of violence and offenses. His record included convictions for assault with a weapon in 1982 and commercial burglary just 2 months prior to the abduction of Michaela Garrick in 1988. At the time of the 1986 murders, David was a known commercial burglar and substance user living in the Fremont area. He was also a convicted. In December 1989, approximately 3 years after the murders, David committed another violent crime that would put him behind bars for life. He was convicted of the stabbing death of 36-year-old Margaret Ball in Hayward. It's said that David would often perform odd jobs upon Ball's request. Police investigators determined that Michelle and Dewey had no prior history or contact with David before they were killed. When David was faced with this evidence in prison, he concocted an elaborate story to explain away his DNA presence at the crime scene. He claimed that he had witnessed the 2 young women being kidnapped at gunpoint by 2 unknown men at a gas station and had attempted to intervene as a good Samaritan to save them. According to his account, the DNA found under Dewey's fingernails came from her scratching him during this supposed rescue attempt. He portrayed himself as a, quote, protector of all the girls and in the area. Obviously, this explanation was met with skepticism by investigators who noted numerous inconsistencies in David's story. During his 2024 trial, David offered yet another version of events, which was the previously mentioned substance deal that involved the 2 women. He testified that he and Dewey had shared a cigarette during this alleged transaction, which he claimed explained the presence of his DNA under her fingernails. "I walked off with her cigarette," David told the court, adding that he'd, quote, never even heard of Mill Creek Road until this case. On December 19th, 2024, after weeks of testimony and deliberation, the jury returned guilty verdicts on 2 counts of first-degree murder. On January 21st, 2025, David was scheduled to be sentenced for the murders of Michelle Xavier and Jennifer Dewey. What should have been a solemn moment of closure for the victims' families instead became a shocking display of disrespect. During the sentencing hearing, as family members and friends of the victims gave their impact statements detailing the decades of pain and loss they had endured, David began singing 99 bottles of beer on the wall. Even after being taken to a nearby holding cell, David continued his disruptive behavior by whistling, demonstrating his complete contempt for the proceedings and the victims' families. Ultimately, David received 2 consecutive terms of 25 to life. Given his age of 63 at the time of the sentencing, this effectively ensures that David will spend the remainder of his life behind bars. Una Crown was reportedly born in either 1926 or 1927 in England, depending on the source, making her 86 years old at the time of her death in January 2013. She lived out her final years in the small market town of Whisbech, Cambridgeshire. Her home was a bungalow located on Magazine Lane, a quiet residential street where she had lived for many years. Una was married to Jack Rowland Crown for 6 decades until Jack passed away on December 26, 2009. His death occurred just over 3 years before Una's own tragic murder. Throughout their long marriage, the couple never had children. This meant that in the years following Jack's death in 2009, Una lived entirely alone in the bungalow they had once shared. Without children of her own, Una's closest living relatives were more distant family members, including her brother Terry White and her niece Judith Payne. Una stood at 4 feet 10 inches tall, but despite her advanced age and diminutive stature, she was described as vigorously independent and rather feisty. Her friends and family described her as a woman who was not afraid to speak her mind and stand up for herself. She also continued to cook, clean, and care for herself in her own home without requiring daily assistance. However, this does not mean she didn't face struggles. She was occasionally unbalanced on her feet and thus often used a walking stick when moving about. In her older age, Una formed a weekly routine with Judith and her husband, John Payne. Every Friday morning, John would drive to Una's residence to pick her up for their weekly trip to the supermarket for essentials. Una could not drive herself to the store, and at 86 years old, with occasional unsteadiness on her feet, shopping independently was also challenging. But even during these regular Friday visits, Una maintained strict boundaries around her privacy and the sanctity of her home. Prosecutors noted that she was fiercely protective of her own privacy. John was never invited into Una's home after the shopping trips and always stopped short of the front door to allow Una to bring all of the day's purchases inside. Additionally, the Paynes would take Una out on Sunday to have lunch together. This routine would ultimately lead to the gruesome discovery of Una's lifeless remains. At approximately 5 p.m. on January 12, 2013, Una spoke on the telephone with her neighbor, Mrs. Swain. This phone conversation would become one of the last documented communications Una had with anyone before her death. During the call, Una said that all was well with her. She reported that she had already eaten dinner and had completed washing up the dishes afterward. She also shared that she didn't plan to do anything out of the ordinary that evening. After concluding the phone call around 5 p.m., Una began watching her television. Based on the evidence presented at trial, prosecutors determined that Una was murdered sometime between 7 p.m. and 9 p.m. It was during this window of time that Una was disturbed by an intruder entering her home. This intruder would be revealed as David Newton years after the incident. Evidence indicated that Newton had been drunk on the night of January 12, 2013. Prosecutors told the jury that Newton had been, quote, pestering elderly women on the telephone that evening. Newton had also attempted to visit some female relatives in Whisbech earlier that evening while under the influence of alcohol. Furthermore, a witness would later testify that they saw Newton out walking his dog on Magazine Lane, Una's street, on the evening of January 12th. Newton's wife, Janet, who died in 2018, told police in an interview conducted in January 2013 that Newton had come home from walking the dog that afternoon for about half an hour. When asked by police what Newton was doing from 5 p.m. onwards that day, Mrs. Newton claimed she couldn't remember but didn't think he went out that night, stating he was home watching TV. However, other evidence would contradict this account. According to trial testimony, at approximately 8:30 p.m. on the day of the crime, a witness saw Newton drunkenly walking away from the direction of Una's home. According to trial testimony, at approximately 8:30 p.m. on January 12, 2013, a witness saw Newton drunkenly walking away from the direction of Una Crown's home. When John Payne arrived the following morning and discovered Una's body, he found that the front door was locked from the outside. There were no signs of forced entry anywhere in the home. No broken windows, no damaged door frames, no evidence that anyone had physically broken in. This meant that the intruder must have either possessed a key to the property or had somehow persuaded or forced Una to let him in. Given Una's private nature, there were doubts that she would have voluntarily let Newton in under any condition. Justice Garnham was quoted saying, "She was very security conscious, and I have the gravest doubts whether she would have let you in if you had knocked at her door." Instead, the judge found as a fact that Newton, quote, had a copy of her backdoor key made for yourself when you had bought her a replacement key at the local locksmith's some months earlier. This unauthorized key copying had occurred during the repair work Newton performed on Una's broken kitchen door lock. While helping with this repair, Newton had accompanied her to a locksmith to purchase a replacement key. During this visit, Newton had secretively arranged to have a duplicate copy made for himself. As for why Newton entered Una's home that night, investigators believe the motivation was tied to a troubling pattern of behavior of Newton's. On numerous occasions, he had entered other people's property uninvited in search of conversation and company. For the most part, these encounters were harmless, but nevertheless, it made all of the victims very uncomfortable. And that's not to mention, on some of these outings, Newton would also be drunk. Such was the case when he visited Una. After hearing a noise, Una went to investigate the source to find that it was Newton entering her home with the key he had copied. At some point during this confrontation, Una attempted to call for help. The telephone in her home was later found hanging off its cradle. Brutal violence quickly ensued, with Newton first striking Una's head, causing bruising to her ear. Newton then entered the kitchen to retrieve a large kitchen knife, which he used to stab Una multiple times. There were wounds on both her chest and neck, with several of the stabs striking Una's heart and lungs. Throughout this vicious assault, Una desperately tried to defend herself. She put up her hands in an attempt to stop Newton's attack, resulting in what pathologists identified as defensive injuries, particularly to her right hand. In her desperate struggle with the man who was stabbing her to death, Una managed to scratch her attacker, picking up crucial evidence under her fingernails. This DNA would remain undetected for a decade, but would ultimately bring her killer to justice. After the murder, Newton attempted to destroy evidence of his crime by setting fires. He set 3 small fires within the home. One fire directly by Una's body as it lay on the hallway floor, and 2 others elsewhere in the residence, including fires in the kitchen area. Una's clothing was deliberately set alight in an apparent effort to both disguise her injuries and destroy forensic evidence. These fires caused only moderate amounts of damage to Una's body and to the house. Before spreading to the rest of the property, they self-extinguished. Newton also engaged in theft after killing Una. He emptied her purse, taking 80 euros in cash, and stole her wedding ring and front door key. On January 13th, the day after the murder, Newton was observed playing fruit machines during 2 separate visits to the Whisbech Servicemen's Club, despite being on state benefits as his only source of regular income at the time. On Sunday morning, January 13th, John Payne arrived at Una's home to collect her for their regular Sunday lunch. When Una did not answer the door, John entered the property and made the horrific discovery of Una's body lying face down in the hallway, surrounded by blood and burned newspaper. He then immediately called emergency services. When officers arrived at the scene, they made what prosecutor John Price KC would later describe as a grave error of judgment. Despite clear evidence that Una had suffered a wound to her neck, significant amounts of blood on the floor, and 3 separate fires having been set within the house, the attending police officers concluded that the death was not suspicious. The officers theorized that Una had accidentally set herself on fire while using her stove, attempted to put out the flames with a tea towel, and then died from a heart attack. They rationalized that the 2 cuts to her throat had most likely been caused by pressure from her scarf, which tightened around her neck as her body fell to the floor. Not all officers agreed on this though, creating a dragged-out dispute. Eventually, a more senior officer was called in, but by the time they arrived, the scene had been significantly contaminated. The crime scene had not been sealed off for 2 days. During this critical period, numerous people moved freely through the residence, including police officers, firefighters, paramedics, and even Una's relatives, with some physically touching and moving her body. It was not until the post-mortem examination began that the true nature of Una's death was revealed. When mortuary assistants saw wounds not only to the neck but also to her chest, responsibility for the examination was passed to forensic pathologist Dr. Nat Carey, a specialist who investigates suspicious or sudden deaths. Dr. Carey then concluded that Una was indeed murdered. Despite the catastrophic errors at the crime scene, David Newton actually came to the attention of investigators relatively quickly. He was first arrested on suspicion of murder on January 31st, less than 3 weeks after Una's death. He was held and questioned over the course of 2 days before being released on bail. He was interviewed again in June 2013, during which he denied any involvement in the murder. Once again, he was released on bail. Finally, on July 1st of the same year, Newton was told he would not be charged based on the evidence that was available at that time. The reason for the decision not to charge Newton in 2013 was simple. Despite suspicions, investigators did not have sufficient forensic evidence to link him definitively to the crime scene and prove his involvement beyond reasonable doubt. For the next decade, Una's case remained unsolved. In the years that followed, Cambridgeshire police made regular appeals for witnesses and information, but no charges were brought. In March 2023, a full decade later, police made a renewed push to solve the case. The charity Crime Stoppers offered a reward of up to €20,000 for information leading to the arrest and conviction of those responsible. The case was also featured again on the BBC's Crime Watch Live program in March 2023. The breakthrough came through the application of a pioneering DNA testing technique called YSTR testing, which had not been available in 2013. This specialized technique specifically targets areas only on the Y chromosome, meaning that only male DNA is detected. When investigators retested Una's fingernail clippings, they found not only traces of Una's blood, but also a male DNA profile. This profile was ultimately determined to be that of David Newton. On March 20th, 2023, Newton was visited at his home by police officers and asked to provide a new DNA specimen. On April 15, 2024, Newton was rearrested at his home. He was taken into custody at Thorpewood Police Station in Peterborough. That same day, he was formally charged with the murder of Una Crown. The announcement of Newton's arrest and charge brought a mixture of relief and renewed grief to Una's family, who had waited more than a decade for answers. David Newton, who was 70 years old at the time of trial, denied the murder charge. However, he did not give evidence during the trial, and his defense team called no witnesses. The jury deliberated for a total of 29 hours and 13 minutes over the course of 6 days. On the morning of Thursday, February 13th, 2025, they returned to the courtroom. By a majority verdict of 10 jurors to 2, the jury found David Newton guilty of the murder of Una Crown. Ultimately, Newton received a life imprisonment with a minimum term of 21 years. Leslie Ann Jennings was born on October 5, 1951 in Quonset Point, Rhode Island, a naval air station community located on the western shore of Narragansett Bay. Born to parents William Jennings Jr. and Miriam Jennings, Leslie was one of 8 children in a military family. From her earliest years, Leslie was described by those who knew her as sensitive and kind-natured. In 1963, when Leslie was 12 years old, the Jennings family relocated from Rhode Island to Pensacola, Florida. This was home to Naval Air Station Pensacola, often called the cradle of naval aviation, making it a natural destination for military families. There, Leslie attended Pensacola High School, where she completed her secondary education and graduated with the class of 1969. Following her graduation, she pursued higher education at the University of Florida, enrolling in their journalism program. It was during Leslie's time at the University of Florida that she met Carl Eugene Preer III, who went by the nickname Sandy. Sandy was also a student at the university, pursuing studies in marketing. The two would go on to get married to each other on October 26, 1974. 3 years later, the couple had a daughter named Lauren. Then in 1982, the family moved to Chevy Chase, Maryland, a suburb located right on the border of Washington, D.C. For nearly 2 decades following their move, the Preers built what appeared to be an idyllic life, but that would come crumbling on Wednesday, May 2nd, 2001. The day began as usual, with Sandy getting up to prep for another day of work. Leslie, too, was preparing for her day, getting ready to commute into Washington, D.C. for her job at an advertising production company. Around 7:30 a.m., Sandy left the house, leaving Leslie behind as she continued getting ready. As he departed through the front door, he called out a goodbye. This was heard by a neighbor named Meg Bloom, who was outside loading her child into her car. Another neighbor, Mary Lewis, was also outside that morning with the children she babysat. Lewis spent the entire morning outdoors in close proximity to the Preer residence, engaging in various chores. According to her later statement to police, she did not hear or see anything unusual throughout the morning. No screams, no sounds of struggle, no indication whatsoever that anything was amiss at the Preer home. After Sandy's departure, Leslie should have left for work shortly thereafter. Her commute typically took only about an hour by bus, meaning she should have arrived at her workplace by mid-morning. She was known as a punctual and reliable employee, someone who took her responsibility seriously. If she was going to be late or unable to come to work for any reason, she would always call ahead to let her supervisor know. This consistency made what happened next all the more alarming. By 10 a.m., Leslie had not arrived at her workplace. As the minutes ticked by and she still didn't appear, her absence became increasingly suspicious. Brett Reedy, her supervisor, grew concerned. She hadn't called to explain her absence, she hadn't left any message, and attempts to reach her by telephone went unanswered. Brett's concern deepened as the morning progressed without any word from Leslie. Deciding that the situation warranted immediate attention, Brett began calling Leslie's emergency contacts. He reached out to both Leslie's husband Sandy and their daughter Lauren to inquire whether they knew Leslie's whereabouts or if there was any explanation for her absence. Both Sandy and Lauren were surprised and confused to learn that Leslie hadn't shown up at work. Lauren, who maintained daily contact with her mother and spoke with her every single morning, was equally puzzled and immediately worried. Brett and Sandy both sensed that something was seriously amiss. They couldn't shake the feeling that Leslie might be hurt, that she might need help, that something terrible might have happened. At this point, both of them decided to go to the Preer residence to see if Leslie had run into some sort of problem. They arrived at around 11:30 a.m. and as they entered the home, they were immediately confronted with a disturbing scene. They called out for Leslie, receiving no response. Then they saw the blood. Streaks of red painted the walls near the front door, while dried bloodstains marked the floor, and in the corner a table had been knocked over. Most disturbingly, the rug that usually lay in the foyer had been dragged into the living room and it was soaked with blood. While Sandy moved through the first floor of the house searching for his wife, Brett immediately contacted police saying, "We just walked in the door, her husband and I, and there's blood in the foyer." As officers arrived and proceeded through the house, they noted additional troubling signs. There was blood on the stairs leading to the upper level. The kitchen's back door was standing open, and there was additional blood found in multiple other rooms, indicating movement through the house after the initial violence in the foyer. It didn't take long for the searching officers to make the discovery that everyone feared. In the master bathroom, they found Leslie. Her body was lying face down, partially inside the upstairs bathroom shower stall. Her legs extended out from the shower doors onto the tile floor of the bathroom, positioned in a way that suggested she had been dragged. The shower was running when police discovered her, water streaming over her body. The chief medical examiner's office conducted the autopsy, though Leslie's death wasn't immediately treated as a major homicide investigation. According to Captain Barney Forsyth of the Major Crimes Division, the scene didn't initially appear to be an obvious homicide, so full evidence processing was delayed until after the autopsy results came back 2 days later on May 4th. This delay meant that several important pieces of evidence, including blood-stained door frames, were not fully processed for several days. The autopsy revealed that Leslie had sustained 7 lacerations to the front and back of her head, consistent with her skull being repeatedly battered against the sharp edges of the baseboards and front door area. She also had multiple bruises on her arms, legs, and torso. Her neck also showed severe hemorrhaging as a result of being strangled. Her death was ruled a homicide resulting from multiple blunt force trauma to the head with strangulation as a contributing factor. Prosecutors later described it as an unrelenting attack that was painful, protracted, and terrifying, noting that Leslie had raised her hands to shield her face as the killer, quote, kept going and going until she was dead. After the official homicide ruling, police first investigated Leslie's husband, Sandy. The original police reports from the initial investigation documented several observations that raised red flags for investigators and contributed to the growing suspicion surrounding Sandy. Detectives conducting neighborhood canvasses spoke with multiple residents living on the same block, gathering information about anything unusual they might have noticed in the hours and days surrounding Leslie's murder. One neighbor's statement proved particularly intriguing. This individual told police that on the night before Leslie's body was discovered, he had observed something unusual about Leslie and Sandy's home. Looking at the house, he noted that, quote, every light was on in the house, illuminating the entire home from top to bottom. However, despite all the lights being on, every single drape and blind in the house was closed, shutting out any view into the interior. The neighbor told police that this had never occurred in the past with the home. This observation raised several questions, the obvious being whether or not this indicated Sandy was up late into the night moving through different rooms for some mysterious purpose. If you recall, I mentioned that one of the neighbors named Meg Bloom reported seeing Sandy leaving his home and calling out goodbye. At that same time, another neighbor stated that Sandy greeted them, which he had never done in the past. This detail may seem meaningless, but investigators felt that it was worth noting as it was another out-of-character behavior. Just days after the murder, detectives brought Sandy in for formal taped interviews. During these sessions, Sandy made several statements that would cast a long shadow over the subsequent investigation and fuel suspicions about his potential involvement. Most significantly, he admitted to investigators that his marriage to Leslie had been strained in the period leading up to her death. Sandy mentioned that one of the primary issues the couple was dealing with was Leslie's drinking. He said Leslie was in absolute love, beauty when she didn't drink, but when she did, she would have a lot. And in all honesty, it's one of the reasons why I'd kind of come home late because it was getting hard to deal with. Sandy also revealed that both he and Leslie had been feeling pressure at work. They were struggling to keep up with their bills, adding an additional layer of strain on their relationship. When investigators asked Sandy about his whereabouts and activities on the evening before Leslie's death, his response raised additional suspicions. He told detectives that he had been running errands that evening, providing a fairly comprehensive account of his movements. According to his statement, his errands included stopping at the dump to dispose of items. He then visited 3 different stores in his search for a battery charger, moving from location to location as he tried to find what he needed. After completing these errands, Sandy stated that he returned home around 9 p.m., at which point he found everything normal in the household. As circumstantial evidence and suspicious circumstances continued to mount, investigators asked Sandy to submit to a polygraph test. He agreed to take the test and he failed. For investigators already viewing Sandy with suspicion based on the other circumstances of the case, this failed polygraph provided what seemed like strong corroborating evidence of his potential guilt. However, it's important to note that polygraph tests are controversial and far from infallible. 2 months after Leslie's death, forensic test results provided a crucial piece of evidence that dramatically shifted the investigation. DNA analysis revealed male DNA found under Leslie's fingernails and blood samples at 3 locations throughout the house belonging to one unknown male. This DNA did not match Sandy. The profile was compared to several other men in Leslie's life, but all were excluded. The profile was then uploaded into the FBI's National DNA Database, with hopes that a match could someday be found. With Sandy excluded as a suspect and no DNA matches in the database, the investigation stalled. Investigators explored other possibilities, including whether Leslie's death was connected to other unsolved murders in Montgomery County. The case eventually went cold, leaving Leslie's family with devastating unanswered questions. Although police had cleared Sandy, he lived under a cloud of suspicion for years. Some of Leslie's relatives believed he must have been responsible, but his daughter Lauren steadfastly defended him, knowing her parents had shared a loving relationship. Sandy was devastated by his wife's death and mourned deeply. Tragically, he died in 2017 without ever learning the truth behind his wife's death. Lauren later told the Washington Post that she believed her father died of a broken heart. In 2022, the Montgomery County Police Department's Cold Case Unit announced that they would take a fresh look at Leslie's case, reaching out to the public for any information that might have emerged over the intervening 2 decades. With new advancements in technology and the DNA from Leslie's fingernails, a DNA match was found linked to a family line in Romania with the surname Gligor. This name was of particular interest as shortly after Leslie's murder, a tipster had mentioned a man with that same surname as possibly being involved. Further investigation revealed that the suspect's first name was Eugene, and he was Lauren's high school boyfriend. He had been warmly welcomed into the family home, going on trips with them, playing board games, and becoming close to Leslie. However, Sandy had reportedly been more cautious about Eugene, telling Lauren that something was off about him, though he couldn't articulate exactly what. Lauren and Eugene dated for approximately 5 years, but their relationship ended amicably after they went off to college and drifted apart. When they ran into each other in subsequent years, there was no apparent tension. In fact, Lauren had even given Eugene's name to detectives as part of a longer list of people in Leslie's life shortly after the murder, though there was no indication in the case file that he had ever been interviewed or swabbed for DNA like the other men on the list. To confirm their suspicions without alerting Gligor, detectives devised an elaborate sting operation. They learned that on June 9th, 2024, Gligor would be flying back to Washington Dulles International Airport from London. When he arrived at the airport, customs officers diverted him into a room for a second screening. On a table in the screening room, positioned there in advance by Montgomery County detectives, were several bottles of water. Gligor took the bait and drank from one of the bottles and then discarded it. After he left the room, detectives entered and collected the water bottle as evidence. Within a week, the DNA results confirmed investigators' suspicions. Gligor's DNA was a direct match to the DNA collected from Leslie's crime scene and from under her fingernails. Armed with this conclusive evidence, Montgomery County Police obtained an arrest warrant. On the morning of June 18th, 2024, a surveillance team set up outside Gligor's apartment in Washington, D.C., where the 44-year-old had been living and working as an account executive for a video surveillance company. When they saw him come outside and take a seat on the stairs of his apartment building, scrolling through his phone and drinking coffee, they made their move. Gligor was bewildered as the officials brought him into custody and moved him into interrogation. Despite the DNA evidence confronting him, Gligor denied any involvement in the murder and claimed he had no recollection of that day. As investigators delved into his past, a complex picture emerged. To friends and colleagues, Gligor appeared warm and seemingly committed to personal growth and self-improvement. He had lived quietly in Washington's U Street corridor, maintaining what appeared to be a normal professional life. However, those who knew him also stated that he had a dark side that could be mean and condescending. In high school, he struggled with his parents' divorce, and what began as harmless teenage mischief soon escalated to allegations of theft and substance abuse. Lauren recalled a disturbing incident when she was 16 years old, where Gligor was accused of assaulting a woman on a bike path. Police believed he matched the suspect's description, but Lauren didn't think it could be true. She and her best friend went to the police station to defend him, both insisting, quote, "There is no way Eugene could have done this." Decades later, after his arrest for her mother's murder, Lauren wondered if that accusation might have been true after all. Following Leslie's murder in 2001, Gligor's behavior raised retrospective red flags. Despite his closeness to the family, he did not attend the funeral. Instead, he chose to make a sudden, last-minute road trip to Portland, Oregon on the day of the service. 3 months after the murder, Eugene and his mother moved out of the neighborhood. Over the next 2 decades, he traveled around the country, marrying and divorcing twice. He struggled with alcoholism, and his behavior became increasingly erratic and unpredictable. In 2021, his second wife sought a protective order against him, accusing him of violent outbursts, though her request was ultimately denied. Court records showed that Gligor had a history of arrests for weapons possession and theft, but he was never charged with any crimes that would require his DNA to be entered into the FBI's database. Gligor was initially charged with first-degree murder, which carries a maximum penalty of life imprisonment in Maryland. Montgomery County State's Attorney John McCarthy announced he would be seeking the maximum charge. However, Gligor's attorneys launched an aggressive defense, filing motions to have key evidence excluded from the case. On May 6, 2025, he stood in a Montgomery County courtroom and pleaded guilty to second-degree murder as part of a plea deal. By accepting the deal, Gligor faced a maximum sentence of 30 years in prison instead of a possible life term for first-degree murder. Before his sentencing, Gligor addressed the court and Leslie's family. Crying, he apologized multiple times, directly addressing Lauren. He claimed that in the days leading up to the killing, he had experienced blackouts due to heavy alcohol and use. According to his statement, he vaguely remembered entering the home around 9:30 a.m. on the morning of May 2nd and getting into a physical altercation with Leslie, but everything after that was a blur. I vaguely remember leaving the house in the morning, but the rest is a blur. I know Lauren and Leslie's family want to know why I was there and what happened. I'm sorry, I'm unable to remember and provide an explanation, Gleiger told the court. He added, Leslie always was very kind to me, and Lauren and Leslie's family, I'm so sorry for causing you so much misery and hardship. As the judge sentenced Gleiger to 30 years in prison, cheers and yells broke out in the courtroom, with Leslie's family members celebrating. Following the sentencing, Gleiger filed a motion asking the court to reconsider his sentence. As of October 2025, he is serving his sentence at the Maryland Correctional Training Center in Hagerstown, Maryland.